Alright, looks like we are up and running, in theory. So the third iteration of the patch 9.20 just came out on the common test, and so that pretty much looks like they're wrapping that up. So I'm guessing that within the next week we're going to have that being pushed out to the live server. So I thought I'd do a quick mini review on some of the changes that will be coming up and what I think about them. So I figured the best or the easiest place to start would be to just go through some of the what I think are notable changes in the um, tanks, and then we'll talk about the new Chinese tank destroyers as well. So anyhow, one of the things that they did was nerf the mouse. This was probably expected, given that the mouse was pretty strong in terms of a 1v1. They nerfed it pretty significantly, particularly in the DPM category. So we'll have to see how that shakes out. Remember, my general opinion is that the mouse was a really strong tank, but it wasn't necessarily good in random battles, simply because you can never really depend on what map you're going to get, and there are a lot of maps that the mouse just wasn't that conducive to. They did buff the JT88 a little bit, but that's probably was a long time coming as well. And then we'll talk about the Chinese tank destroyers in a little bit. One of the things that they did do is they buffed the T-54 First Proto, which is the premium tier 8 medium Russian tank. And that was probably necessary because it really suffered whenever it was in tier 10 games. They buffed the base penetration of both the base AP shells and the APCR shells that are on it, but I don't think that that's that significant of a bump. This was a significant problem for these tanks against tier 10s. I don't know that going from 183 to 190 is really going to help that much, but it certainly doesn't hurt. They also made some changes to a few of the other tier 8s, but we'll just skip over that. Again, I'm just going to sort of hit on what I think are the important changes. One of the interesting changes that they did do was make changes to the T-54 in terms of the D10 T2S gun and the D-54 gun. And previously, the D10 T2S gun was far superior, just because it had the same or better gun control / accuracy as a D-54 with better aim time. And so they've changed both of these guns pretty significantly in terms of buffing the D-54, and we'll put that in air quotes, and nerfing the D10 T2S. And you go look at it and you go, oh, but look, they reduced the reloading time, meaning that they gave more DPM to the D10 T2S, and they actually nerfed the DPM of the D-54. So why do I say that this is a nerf overall of the D10 T2S and not of the D-54? And so in order to talk about that, we'll look at in the game, because it's pretty significant. If I can find my Russian tanks. And so these are the two guns in question, the D10 T2S, which is on the left here, and the D-54, which is on the right. And so what they did was they have the same alpha, right? But the D10 T2S has a much better rate of fire, right? You get a whole extra round per minute, and that translates to a lot of DPM. But what they did was they nerfed the accuracy of the D10 T2S pretty significantly, and they nerfed the aim time of the D10 T2S. Now, what was interesting, so basically this used to be 0.3 volt. I already don't remember, so let's put that back up. The 0.35. Right, so this used to be 0.35 here for the D10 T2S, and it was a 2.3 second aim time, and they've bumped it up to 2.5 seconds, which isn't that much, but it does hurt a little bit. And again, remember the sort of butter zone is that sort of 2.3 second aim time for medium tanks, in my opinion, for generally what you're doing in terms of trying to get quick shots off. Now, what they did to the D-54, right, they did nerf the rate of fire a little bit, so you're going to have less DPM, so that's a trade-off, but it's more accurate now than it was before, and it had a massive decrease in the amount of aim time. So previously the aim time for this tank was 2.9 seconds, and now it's 2 seconds, which is an interesting change. And so I tend to think that overall what that might mean is that the D54 might pass up the D10 T2S now as the optimal gun in the, for the T54, depending on your play style, because you're going to find that you're not going to hit these shots as often, and the aim time is actually going to be an annoyance. Whereas in this one, you're going to be able to pull off more snapshots and do things like that. And so I tend to think that we'll experiment with it a little bit, but I tend to think that the D54 will probably overtake the T2S as the primary gun for the T54. And that's an interesting set of changes. And I wonder if eventually they will nerf, because 2 second aim time is really low. But I suppose we'll see. No, the patch is not out yet. I'm just going over it because it's in the third iteration right now. So I'm guessing that within the week they'll have the patch pushed out to live. Okay, the other interesting thing that they did was they buffed the IS-7, and they buffed it on a number of fronts, but you don't have to worry too much about the dispersion and whatnot, because it's not like it's fantastic now or anything like that. But what's really interesting to me is not just that they buffed the specific power, but that they buffed the health of this tank from 2150 to 2400. That's a pretty significant increase, and you'll have to remember that they just nerfed the health of the mouse by 200, and so it'll be interesting to see how long this lasts in terms of the playability for the IS-7. But it's an interesting sort of set of buffs for the IS-7 itself. And then they did add the Foch 50B, the 50 Foch B. Let's just call it Foch B. To replace the 155, and we'll talk about that a little bit, and we'll go over that in the garage. But I didn't see a whole lot there. They did change the gun depression on the 5100 from 6 degrees to 9 degrees, which is interesting. I think. I mean, I never really thought of it as having issues in terms of gun depression. 6 degrees is probably the minimum amount of gun depression that you need to shoot somebody that's on level ground. But with 9 degrees, that sort of changes the way that you'll use this 100 mil gun a little bit for the better. They also changed the amount of ammo that some of these French tanks can hold, which is really only relevant for the Batchat 25s, because that was really the only tanks you were ever constantly concerned about running out of ammo with. They did buff the Foch, the tier 9 Foch as well. And if you had the Foch 155, then you get the Foch B according to certain parameters. The other significant thing that they did is they buffed both the AMX-30 prototype and the AMX-30B in order to make them more competitive. They basically, long story short, they made the guns better, and that'll be interesting to see, particularly given that they've given them pretty significant buffs to DPM, how that sort of translates to their role in the battlefield, because they are still going to be more of that second line sniper, but with increased DPM, that's going to make it certainly more interesting to see those tanks. And then they nerfed the Type 5 Heavy and the Type 4 Heavy because they were just too strong. Too strong. Tanks too good. And then, so all of those changes were made on the first iteration of test, and then the second iteration of test, they were all just little bug fixes and things like that. And it's the same thing for the third iteration of test. They were all really just little bug fixes, and that's why I think that probably now they're going to go ahead and start pushing it out to live. And so I anticipate live servers relatively soon, which is why we're doing this. So as far as the changes to the, we'll talk about the changes to the Foch 50B, this guy. And so just for comparisons, this is the old gun on this tank. So this is the Foch 50B. It looks exactly like the Foch 155. It just has a different gun on it. It's this 120 mil gun. It's a 6 shell clip, which I'm not entirely convinced is going to be that good. It has a 2-second load time, which is reasonably short. It's pretty much akin to like what you see on a lot of the French heavy tanks. But I'm not entirely sure that a 6-shell clip with 400 alpha is going to be good on a tank destroyer. We'll kind of have to see how that plays out overall. When you compare it to what it used to be, which is essentially this sort of high pen, high alpha clip. Even though it took a lot longer in order to get that clip out, it was a lot more punitive. And nobody was saying that the Foch 155 was a super strong tank. So I don't see how you go from a Foch 155 not being a very strong tank to putting a worse gun on it, ostensibly a worse gun, and saying that it got better. So I tend to think that this tank is probably not going to be very awesome either. And then generally what I do when new lines come out is I'll take a look at when I feel like common test is getting close to completed. I'll look at the tanks in the line and I'll decide where I want to sort of jump in here. And if the line itself is pretty good, then I'll generally jump into 2 different tanks, and I'll generally do 2 consecutive tanks. So like I'll do the tier 4 and the tier 5 for example, and so I'll put a crew in the tier 4 and I'll put a crew in the tier 5, and then I'll just sort of play through them, and then I'll sort of leapfrog the crew as I go through, so that I'll have multiple crews as I get to the end. That way, if I want to keep one of the tanks along the way, I can do that. For this particular line, you guys may have heard me talk about it before, and it's my impressions of this line is that essentially, it's a clone of the Russian tank destroyer line for the 268, and so I didn't really think that it was going to be that good. But then I went through and I looked at the individual tanks, and we'll sort of talk about that. But in this particular case, we're probably only going to play 1 crew through this, because I don't really see many tanks in here that I'm like, oh yeah, this is a keeper. But we'll go through and we'll talk about some interesting ones and why they're interesting. And so I actually found some of the low tier ones to be fairly interesting in terms of both this tier 3 and this tier 4. And the reason why these are interesting to me is that they actually have pretty good specific power, right? They have a good power to weight ratio and top speed, which means that these tanks are going to be relatively fast. And when you look at the guns like on this tier 3, essentially what this looks like is that it looks like a Marder 3, the German tier 3 tank destroyer, except it looks like it's a more nimble version of that, and it's got a pretty good gun on it for a tier 3 tank as well. And so I think that this tier I don't know that I'm going to play through the tier 3, but I think that the tier 3 would be relatively fun to play. I also think that this tier 4 is going to be interesting for the same reasons. It does have a really good specific power, which means it's going to be relatively mobile, and it has a pretty good gun on it, whether you use this 76 or this 85. So I think that those 2 might be interesting to play. And what's interesting, or sort of the trend on this line, is much like in the Russian line, it goes towards this more of an SU-100 shaped, SU-85, SU-100 shaped tank, where you get this sort of sloped front plate that the gun is mounted to. Now, unfortunately, for this tier 6 version, wrong button. Unfortunately, for this tier 6 version, I'm sorry, I didn't talk about the tier 5 version yet. So this tier 5 version, the reason why I like the tier 3 and the tier 4, but not the tier 5, is that now when you get to the tier 5, that specific power drops significantly by about half. And that's a pretty big problem for a tank that it's got an okay gun on it, but you're not really going to have very much mobility at all. And this relatively speaking, this is a tall tank without any armor, and so you're going to be rather vulnerable for a tank that has very little mobility. And I think that's going to be an issue for the tier 5. And the tier 6, however, is interesting because all of a sudden it goes back, not by much, right? You go, oh well, the specific power of the stock tank is only 15. But what's interesting about this tank in particular is that when you look at the base engine for this tank, it's 300 horsepower, but when you look at the upgraded engine, it's 430 horsepower, and that's basically a 50% increase in power for the tank. And so that's going to bump up this specific power relatively significantly compared to the tier 5 version. And so I think that the mobility on this tier 6 isn't actually going to be that bad, and this 100 mil that's on the tier 6 is actually pretty good. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So we'll probably start at this tier 6 when it goes to live server, and we'll unlock the engine certainly, and probably the gun. They have a lot more interesting gun options for these lines, or you have to sort of decide. But in this particular tier, it's not really that much of an option, because 145 pen at tier 6 is okay, but 181 pen at tier 6 is pretty good. So you'd rather have this. And then the rest of the line is a little bit poopy. Basically what ends up happening is that the specific power for all of these tanks just starts going downhill, and so the sort of saving factor of the tier 6 is the fact that the second engine, the upgraded engine on it, is a huge increase over the base engine. The problem is that when you get to the tier 7, the weight of the tank increases significantly, right? It goes from I think the weight of the tier 6 base tank is like 20 metric tons, right here. 19.73 metric tons, whereas the weight of the tier 7 is 50% more, and that hurts you a lot, because that means that as this engine power increases, you're not going to get as much of a benefit from it. And this is only like a 15% increase in terms of engine power here, and so I don't think that I think the mobility on the tier 7 is going to suffer. It does get some interesting gun options in terms of looking at either this 100 or this 122, but I don't know. I mean, I think both of these are interesting. I think I would probably be more on the side of using the 100 over the 122, but I don't know if we'll skip this tank or not. We'll sort of play that by ear. And then tier 8, again, as I was saying, is that the mobility on all of these tanks tends to go into tends to go downhill from tier 6. And the guns do get better. The gun options here are still more like the Object 263, the second Russian tank destroyer line, as opposed to the Object 268, where it goes high alpha, right? You end up getting this 560 average damage, which is pretty good, right? So at tier 8, this is fantastic pen, 271 pen, 560 alpha. It does have a long aim time, and it doesn't have like super great DPM, but this is basically, if you think about using like the ISU 152 with a 122 mil gun on it, that's pretty much what this is. And that's not entirely inspiring as a thought. I'd rather have the ISU with a high alpha than this tank with a lower alpha. But we can see how that plays out as well. And then the tier 9 is the same thing, but you do get the option now, right, to either use this what is basically the same gun on the Object 263, or what is basically the same gun on the Object 268. And I think overall, you'll end up using the higher alpha gun, in large part because these tanks aren't very mobile, so you're not going to be able to relocate to get a lot of good, consistent DPM type of shots. It's going to be more of this one shot as somebody crosses or as somebody is pushing sort of thing, and you need to punish. And the characteristics of the 152 as opposed to the 130 aren't so prohibitive that you wouldn't use the 152 all the time on this tier 9. And then the tier 10 is pretty much the same thing. We talk about in terms of it being similar to the Object 268. It's rather slow. It's kind of tall. It's not quite as sleek and angled as the 268, which means that you're going to take more damage frontally. It does have a significant amount of hull armor, but we got to see how effective that's going to be, particularly at tier 10. It might be okay from a distance, but at close range, I get the feeling that it's not going to do a whole lot for you. But we'll kind of have to see how that plays out as well. I don't think that the tier 10 is a tank that you would necessarily want to rush to per se. So I wouldn't think of it I wouldn't be in too much of a rush to get through it, and I'm certainly not going to be in too much of a rush to get to it. So in recap, I think what we'll probably end up doing is start at tier 6, depending, I don't know, maybe we'll play even through the tier 3s and tier 4s, because I think that those are interesting because of the relative mobility, and then the tier 6 for the same reason. But the tier 6, remember, is going to be slow with the stock engine, and it'll be much more nimble with the upgraded engine. So anyways, that's my mini review of the new tanks that will be coming out. I'm not going to really review the grand battle mode or whatever it's called, because I think we have to see how that plays out in terms of the meta once it hits live. I don't think that you get a good sense of things like that on test.